Now, EU member states are turning on Spain after Friday saw 60,000 migrants cross from Morocco to the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. Italy has responded by suspending the EU Schengen agreement with Spain that allows for free movement between the two countries. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has criticised what he described as their selfish, polarising and illegal reaction to the mass border crossings. Well, joining us to discuss all is the Times Europe editor, Peter Conradi. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
Peter, can you just give us a sense of why these migrants so suddenly streamed into Ceuta in the middle of this week?
That is the big question. We should explain Ceuta, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, to be honest, is, a bit of, it's technically an exclave. So it's a little bit of Spanish territory, not to be confused with an enclave, which is a bit of Spanish territory on the sort of a tip of Africa, surrounded by Moroccan territory, and but it is part of Spain. And what apparently seems to have been happening was that over the past few days, the people were beginning to go in relatively small numbers from Morocco, crossing through the water into Ceuta, and they were sort of inspired, it seems, in part by the fact that there was an amnesty which the Spanish government declared, which ran from April until the end of June, for people, illegal migrants, to kind of in Spain to regularize their situation. So that seemed to have been having an effect, even though that had long since expired. Then there was something else which came, which was there was a judgment by Spain's highest court saying that although people that crossed by land into Spain could be pushed back, those that crossed by water into Spain couldn't be, which meant that if you actually swum round the bit of projecting, the bit sticking out into the sea, a pier or whatever, you could find your way into Ceuta, and they thought not be sent back. And then on this sort of seemed to spread on social media. And according to a version which is emerging in Spain, the Moroccan government, who always has a slightly tense relationship with Spain, appears to have encouraged it a bit. And then suddenly the whole thing, as always happens with social media, really took off. And there were 60,000 people trying to push their way across.
I mean, in a city that has 85,000 inhabitants, I mean, those numbers are extraordinary, aren't they, Peter? And the scenes were extraordinary this week. Now, there's been an interesting response from other EU countries. Explain what's been happening.
Yeah, well, now, Spain is a bit of an outlier when it comes to immigration policy, because the rest of Europe, almost every country in Europe, has been tightening their policy on immigration, has been talking tough on immigration, either because they themselves are on the right or because they fear the far right, particularly coming to power. Spain is the big difference from that, because Sanchez, the Spanish prime minister, is a socialist, and he's pursuing a completely different policy, which is to say, look, migration is actually quite a good thing. It's good for our economy. It helps us to grow. We've got an aging population. Not enough people are having kids, all this kind of stuff. And of course, the amnesty, which I just mentioned. So this has put him at odds with almost everyone else in Europe. So therefore, when this happened, the other European countries, led by Giorgia Meloni, jumped in and were very, very quick to blame him. And he, of course, retaliated and sort of put up a very, very angry statement on social media, criticising, which you just quoted from, criticising the selfish, polarising and unlawful reaction of all his neighbours. So quite a mess, really.
I understand Denmark's also waded in quite heavily, almost from the other side on this.
Yeah, no, Denmark is always an interesting example, because the Prime Minister there, Mette Frederiksen, is a social democrat, but she's a social democrat who is tough on immigration. I mean, maybe not unlike the British Home Secretary. And in fact, Labour appears to be taking some of its policies from Denmark. So she basically was very quickly to join Giorgia Meloni, who's been leading the attack on Spain. And I mean, Italy's been doing more than talking. It has actually said that it is going to suspend the Schengen Agreement, which is sort of the free movement agreement between 29 European countries, as far as people coming from Spain are concerned. So if you come from Spain to Italy, necessarily by plane or by boat, because there's no land border, the Italians have said, right, we reserve the right to check your passport. So they've, in a sense, that will be a sort of like a temporary suspending of the Schengen rules, which you're allowed to do, but only vis-a-vis Spain.
Peter, will these sort of punitive actions continue, do we think, given that most of the migrants who flooded across the border during the week have actually now been returned?
Well, I mean, that's the sort of the crazy thing about it, because this flared up very dramatically, very suddenly. But, in terms of the immediate problem, has been resolved extraordinarily quickly, because all but 2,000, I think, of the people that came were persuaded, in inverted commas, or voluntarily, went back to Morocco. So, I mean, the whole thing is really very odd, because it's essentially, another 2,000 people is another 2,000 people, but it's not an enormous amount. And in fact, interestingly, in the broader context in Europe is that the number of people crossing irregularly into the Schengen area is about 49% down on last year, which doesn't really fit public perceptions that everything is getting worse and worse and worse, but is the reality. And in fact, as Spain has pointed out quite gleefully, it is much better at stopping illegal migrants coming into its country than Italy is in stopping them coming into it.
Yeah. Peter, there was also a dramatic rise in the number of migrant crossings in the British Channel this week, and half a dozen deaths as well. Is it just a coincidence that these two incidents happened in the same week?
Yeah, completely. I mean, and again, yes, I think it was Wednesday which saw the largest number of people crossing the Channel to Britain in a single day. But also overall for Britain so far this year, the numbers are not at a record high. They're actually lower than they were in several of the past few years. I mean, in terms of Channel crossings, which I'm from Paris where I'm based, I watch quite closely. I've been up to Calais and the surrounding along the coast quite a long time. I mean, they are very, very weather dependent.
Yeah.
You get long period. The Home Office, British Home Office, publishes the statistics on how many people come across have come across each day. It really fluctuates quite wildly. But if you were to actually look at that alongside a weather chart, you would see that essentially these people are all waiting in camps. They've paid their money to the smugglers. And when the weather turns, the message comes, come to this beach tonight at 10 o'clock and we'll set off.
I mean, there were allegations that the French authorities were a bit overwhelmed this week and they were just waving migrants through. And the British Border Force have expressed some frustration at, I think, what they see as a inconsistent approach to migrant crossings. Is there... I mean, this has been a constant battle. We were paying the French more to try to stop crossings. Are the French incentivised to properly prevent crossings from that side?
Look, this is a very interesting subject, because this was highlighted by the Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp, who did some videos, which quite powerful videos. Yes. This time it wasn't people dodging underground fares. It was people. Migrants on the beach, and particularly French police not appearing to stop them. Now, I mean, I've spoken to French border police, and basically the rule that they have, under which they operate, is that they can stop people physically when they're on solid ground, but that they can't stop them in the water.
Right.
If, for example, if it potentially would be a danger to them. So, clearly, if you're standing in an ankle of water, water up to your ankles, you're not in danger of drowning. If, however, there are about 80, 100 people on a dinghy in waist or shoulder height water, if you as a policeman run over and, for example, slash the dinghy or start pulling at people, there is the danger that people will fall out, there'll be a crush, people will drown, particularly children, babies will drown. And so the French police themselves contemplating the prospect of wading into waist-high water with their full uniforms on, their, stab jackets on, and so on, and then being held responsible for someone potentially drowning, are reluctant to do this. And so that is a problem that's not really talked about enough, but the actual, the logistics of it are quite interesting.
Yeah, and difficult from a human perspective as well, dealing with those people, I imagine. Peter, before I let you go, I want to talk about the story that you've been writing about for the paper tomorrow. You've been writing about Bernard Arnault, head of the LVMH empire. He's not short of a bob or two, is he? $142 billion he's worth. Now, the rest of us left X alone a while ago, but Bernard, at 80, has just got on X. Why has he decided now is the time for him to start posting?
Yes, it was an odd career move, really. And I mean, before, but you should also bear in mind that the poor guy's lost about 30% of his wealth in the past few years.
Oh, my heart bleeds, Peter.
Well, yeah, I think Jane, you haven't been shopping enough, for any of his 75 luxury products, because there's been a bit of a downturn. Be it Louis Vuitton, be it Christian Dior, whatever, this kind of thing. Even though I think Taylor Swift turned up in one of his frocks.
I'm a bit more of a Zara girl than an LVMH girl, I'm afraid.
Oh, I don't think he stoops that low, I'm afraid. So basically, why has he done it? Because this is a man who, while his products are always out there, he is very much in the shadows, or has been hitherto. And what has happened is in the past few weeks, we've had a few things. We had a rather critical, unauthorised, of course, biography of him that came out, which he tried hardest to ignore. Then he did a 1 3/4 hour interview, or let's say one should say rather conversation, with some of the softest questions I've ever heard on a podcast, which his people claim has been viewed by up to 20 million people across the world, dubbed into about 10 languages. And then finally, there was a sort of an investigative series into him by Le Monde newspaper, spanning 6 pages and running for 20,000 words, all of which I've read, which reveals him to be a very, very odd character indeed. And he just felt tempted to respond to it.
Eccentric billionaire goes on X to post because he feels like he needs his voice heard authentically. Is that basically the size of it?
It sort of is.
Yeah.
And a huge number of people kind of approved him, which was quite interesting, because he's often been portrayed as a sort of a hated, evil, predatory capitalist. And it turns out he's got rather a lot of fans out there. It's not just his handbags they like.
Well, maybe they're all just trying to get a discount, Peter. Who knows?
One can only try.
Peter, thank you so much for your time. It's always wonderful to speak to you. That is Peter Conradi. You're a editor of the Sunday Times, and you can, of course, read about both the migrant crossings in Ceuta and also his story about Bernard Arnault and his ventures on X tomorrow in the Sunday Times, and from later today with your digital subscription, of course.